everyone having a good time in New Orleans? I would damn well hope so. If you're not having a good time here, you're doing it wrong, people. But we are here to talk to you about AI, which is going to be one of the factors that drives our future, whether we like it or not. And what Sairah and Hicham, I'm going to be asking them about is really to help us find something practical, something helpfully skeptical, because, you know, the extreme optimists and pessimists on any issue are almost always wrong. And yet, if we fear the future, we're victims to it. So here's my question. I'll start with you, Sairah, and then Hicham. The Obama administration had passed a report at the end of its term in December 2016 saying that 83% of jobs, people making $20 an hour, 83% of those jobs were going to be basically replaced eventually by AI. To use one industry example, in trucking in the United States, between 2 and 3 million jobs will be lost really by 2030. That is going to cause massive destabilization. So where's the hope that can be found in how we harness this change and have it not lead to an utter meltdown of our civic structure?
Well, I think we spend a lot of time talking about how the negative effects of disruption and an awful lot less time kind of coming up with solutions and imagining what could be created, and that's part of the problem and some of the mystery around AI and, you know, all those kind of negative things. From my point of view, I think there is an awful lot of upside. It's not like we've never gone through technological changes before. There is a period of disruption, but there is always stuff that comes out the other side, and new jobs created that we can't imagine at the moment. And if you think about the breakthroughs happening in healthcare, you think about some of the learning stuff going on, there are answers. And I would love to see more time being poured into how you develop those answers, as opposed to what is often sensationalism around all the jobs that are going to disappear. Of course jobs are going to disappear. They're disappearing all the time. New jobs are going to be created too. And we're going through a rebalancing. And I think it's a good time to think about quite big scale, big picture rebalancing, not just how we replace truckers' jobs, but how is the construct of the economy going to change to support the new the way that the world is changing, and how is that going to move across geographies and cultures and borders, because we're living in a more joined up world now as well.
Sure. So Hicham, I mean, I'll take Sairah's challenge and give it squarely to you. You work in big data. Obviously, crying over horse and buggy makers at the dawn of the auto revolution isn't useful. But what are some specific green shoots that you see that we can be planning towards, whether it's government retraining or other industries that may provide hope to those folks who are likely to really get caught in the middle in the near term?
So I have a very positive view about just the ingenuity of people in general, right? So if you think about AI, you know, you mentioned extremities. There's this fantastical world, that looks, halfway in between the most utopian novel you've read and Westworld, where there's general AI running all around and we're free to just frolic around and do whatever we want. But the reality is that the AI that's here, and that will be here for quite some while, at least long enough for us to understand, what it does is frees us up from the most repetitive, mundane tasks that we have to do, right? And if you think about it that way, basically what you've done is for these millions and millions of people, like unlocked, their ability to just apply the ingenuity that is a couple of clicks above that. And, that's a massive opportunity. So let's set it up as an opportunity. I think that's the first road to success, but I'll give you the answer.
Problem-tunity, but I hear where you're going. I like the optimism.
And so from there, you really have two discussions. One is, how do we invest for that future? And education needs to look wildly different than it looks today. We need to invest way more in art, way more in science, way more in things that allow us, kind of free-form thinking and unstructured play.
When you say we, you mean the government?
I have a view that, government and the private sector, there'll always be this push and pull, depending on how you govern, your country. Some countries are much more, socially led, and government plays a bigger role. Some countries don't, and I think, the message applies to both. I do think government has the opportunity to retrain people. It certainly has, right? We've seen this happen in the agricultural sector, right? We've seen this happen in industries where travel was required to broker a variety of things. So government does have a huge opportunity to retrain people, but I also think the private sector could see the biggest opportunity it's ever had to basically start sharing services and using folks who no longer need to do these repetitive tasks to apply intelligence in all of their pockets of business. So someone who used to be a trucker, right, maybe no longer needs to drive the vehicle and have these like 11-hour, 18-hour shifts where they just get tired all the time. Maybe they're doing smarter inventory placing, and they're understanding, hey, I've got a bad batch of chemicals on this truck. I can make a decision or two as to what I'm going to pick up next, right? Maybe the AI isn't sophisticated enough to do that yet.
Okay.
And people will have this domain expertise, and it'll go to work.
So, Sarah, I mean, obviously, I think we all agree creative destruction is a reality. It's a positive thing. Nothing will be all bad or all good. But the catch-22 we're confronting is that the greater efficiency doesn't necessarily end up helping people in the short run, unless there really is a concerted effort. There's a new book out by Andrew Yang in which he sort of is addressing some of these issues in AI. And so I want to press you towards solutions. Not that I expect you to have all of them, but you mentioned backstage an experiment Finland is undergoing. Is UBI something that governments may start to need to take seriously? Is it the changing definition of what a workday is? Point to some trends that you think are things we should be looking at.
I would caveat everything by saying we're sitting in the US in a western part of the world, so the considerations that we might be thinking about are quite different to some of the considerations in other parts of the world that are perhaps not so wealthy or advanced. But I think I do find the Finnish experiment interesting. They're trying to get at what happens when there are fewer jobs or work has changed so fundamentally. How do you support people? How do you give them a system to operate in? I think that's great. Whether it will work or not, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a small country, so it's a good pilot. So we can all learn from that. I would say that the workday has got to change. I mean, it has to change. It's inevitable. I think it has been changing. Once upon a time, we worked 7 days a week. We went down to 5. I think it's inevitable. We'll do less. Question is, what will we do with the rest of our time, and what will we apply it to? And other trends going on in the world right now include less consumption, which means that business as we know it is going to change to some degree, what we pay for and how
You're talking about like brick and mortar stores in town centers?
Yeah. So we're kind of buying less, so there's less money circulating in economies, and we've relied on a particular system which is also going to have to adapt and change, and you're seeing people bartering with different things, doing things in different ways. Really basic fundamentals are starting to become more malleable, if you like, and flexible and tested in different ways.
I did not expect a return to bartering to come out of this conversation, but I personally would love a return to wampum, because I think that's just a fun word. Plus, it's shells. But give me some specifics here. And how do you feel about UBI? Because it's everybody's right now kind of the card they play, policy-wise. But there are a lot of questions about whether, for example, if UBI is implemented, how much does that get eaten up by inflation on day one? Would there be the discipline to follow through and create other trade-offs, or does that just massively increase government debt in a way that itself becomes existential a crisis?
So, the really neat thing about universal basic income is that it's just a translation of tax and services that we provide to a fend for yourself model and pick the best ones, right? And that trade-off actually could happen in a world where AI is more prevalent and more propagated, and I'll tell you why. The main notion is, I think what we're going to move from over the course of 20, 50 years is this idea that competition drives most of the economic value, right? Whereas with AI, the real opportunity is that cooperation will drive most of the economic value. So you look at, UBS and Credit Suisse, maybe a couple weeks ago, announced that they were exploring sharing back offices, right? Back office functions, because if they pooled their data together, they'd have a better chance at more accurate algorithms, for catching various types of activity like fraud and so on and so forth. Or if you look at, there was a supply chain paper out of MIT where Coca-Cola and Pepsi, should they share their demand forecasting and inventory management, would be 30% more profitable, right? And universal basic income in an environment where actually there's not much competition in the basic services that people need could be something actually quite efficient. And I think that's how I look at it.
But Sarah, let me press this point about the increased efficiency doesn't necessarily end up helping people, right? I mean, that's the contradiction we're confronting with capitalism. And I'm a big believer in liberal capitalist democracy, but that contradiction is something we're going to have to deal with. Give me some more green shoots. Even if it seems fantastical, it didn't take a genius to figure out in the late 1990s when the sort of other industrial jobs were clearly eroding that you need to train people for tech. But there's probably a limit to which people will get trained for highly sophisticated technical jobs.
Well, I come from the creative industries, and I think that's where a lot of the answers lie. Everything that is logic-driven to a large degree is going to become automated, which means that the ability to make leaps into the unknown and think about things in ways that make no sense, that are not logical, is going to be where I think a lot of the jobs come from the future. So there is a lot of talk about, whether you should learn programming and coding now, or whether you should actually move into social sciences and philosophy and other creative arts, liberal arts, in order to get ahead of the game and make yourselves more attractive in the future to be able to respond and come up with these answers.
There is a philosophy department somewhere standing up and cheering for you. This is going to become the secret. Look, I love that. And, I think to Hisham's point as well, it would be wonderful if people were not simply performing repetitive tasks, but were unlocking their true human capital. And look, there is good reason for your, I think, bedrock optimism on this issue, at least when you look at historical context. I found a 1963 Life magazine. It was the summer '63. I'm kind of a nerd that way. I enjoy digging through old magazines. And there was a massive article. It was, I think, called The End of Everything. And it was about automation. And it had one new machine called the Milwaukee Matic that was apparently going to destroy the labor unions as we knew it. Now, they may not have been wrong about the trend of the innovation, but they were certainly wrong about the panic that the end was nigh. So there's a lot of reason to believe in creative destruction and to not get distracted. But there are also other countervailing things. Not too long after that came 2001: A Space Odyssey and HAL. And just a short time ago, we were talking about this backstage, 2 Facebook chatbots started coming up with their own language. How does one navigate that? If you have drones that are thinking for themselves and killing people on their own volition in war contexts, how is that regulated? To what extent should we be actively checking that capacity through regulation or otherwise? Or is that a fool's errand? Either one. Jump ball, big question.
I'll jump on this. I think the scariest thing, at least for me, when it comes to AI, is that we're going to start to lose this thing that we take for granted, is the human right to be judged by another human, right? There's going to be so much augmentation and assistance that maybe you will be denied Medicaid services based on an algorithm. Maybe you will be profiled for potentially bad behavior with young children, and child services will have to take a look at you based on an algorithm. So we do need to kind of stand up.
That's utterly terrifying.
We do need to stand up for, some human rights. You may have the human right to freedom. You may have the human right to be judged by another human at some point in time. There needs to be some control process, and I literally think that we should think about it at that level. And we shouldn't be scared, right? We can do this. We've done it before. On the other side of this is hey, I'm a research scientist and I can simulate a cell, and suddenly I don't need mice to discover the next cure for cancer. I can run 150 experiments in the time that I used to run one, right? That stuff is going to be amazing.
Yeah.
So it's really about understanding it at that higher order first and making sure that there are some strong guardrails there.
It's a great example of the opportunities and dangers. Sarah?
Yeah, there's no doubt we need checks and balances, without a doubt. And I think what makes it so complex is that we're being asked to make moral judgments as much as we are regulatory ones. And that takes time, and it takes bringing together diversity of thought, thinking and opinion so that you touch all bases. Otherwise, you can find yourself legislating for one thing and a problem pops up somewhere else. So I don't think we're going to solve it with one institution or one particular party. I think it's a coalition that has to
Let's
do
talk
that.
about that, because obviously, I mean, government traditionally does the regulation, but as we have seen from various hearings on both sides of the Atlantic, our legislators are incredibly tech illiterate. And that creates, maybe because of age, it may be because of aptitude, but there is a real disconnect. I mean, when Ted Stevens, a U.S. Senator from Alaska, said the internet was a series of tubes not that long ago, I mean, we haven't made measurable progress beyond that conception. So who should be doing the regulating? Because obviously the tech industry has the expertise, but they also have self-interest that may not reflect, the national interest, the human interest.
Well, I think it happens at lots of different levels. So I'm a big believer in individual agency. I think we all have the capacity to influence on a personal level through the work we do, through the things we lobby for. But I also think that business, academia, science, and government has to come together. I was quite interested in the equivalent of CERN being set up in Europe called the Ellis Institute just recently, I think, which is to make sure in Europe we don't fall behind the stuff that's happening in the US and China. And so I think those kind of, to your point about collaborations, that's the only way we're going to get to some kind of meaningful framework, and I think it has to be a framework. We're not going to be able to have hard and fast legislation, at least for a while, because the technology, never mind the human catching up, the technology is moving so fast in its own right. We might even need to have an AI to be able to do that for us.
There we go. It's like recursive feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
I think this is the kind of yin-yang of AI. There's just so much opportunity for us to scale thinking and like learning, right? And on the other hand, just reinforce our biases. Because when you think about, what AI is, it's basically a machine, taking input from the real world and making a decision based on outcome. And that's kind of fantastic. And I think the one thing that we have to keep in check is, it would be completely awesome if we assumed that every decision we made was great. But we know our biases are there, right? You take a look at, say, like a stop and frisk database that the police departments put out. Databases detailing every time someone was stopped, whether or not they had a weapon on them, and their race and their gender and all of these other things. And, machine will encode it without that level of context and may make some correlations that are very scary to us, right? And so we could reinforce our biases as long, we could continue doing that, but we do have to remember things like we don't make the right decisions, we have incomplete data. So stay very skeptical, but, shoot for the optimism.
But I think those universal standards are critical. For example, the IBM versus the Google algorithm for facial recognition is different.
Yes.
And so if you're selling that kind of technology to surveillance, to police in different countries, your experience is going to be different and potentially not just bias, but there's multiple facets within that you can fall between the lines of. So even between the organizations that are developing this technology, they need to collaborate and have a universal standard.
Well, yeah, which will, that is an extreme example of technology outpacing laws because it goes to the heart of national sovereignty, federalism, and other issues that we're not, I think there's a great clamoring to erase those barriers and their basic practical implications. Look, what we're talking about is a who will watch the Watchmen problem, except with a non-human entity. And that is such an extreme, it's the stuff of science fiction. Philip K. Dick was talking about this 30 years ago in an analog world, 40 years ago. But we still don't seem to have any better solutions. And it may just be utterly iterative, as you're both saying. But I am concerned that there aren't the mechanisms to really address it. And let me ask you, Hicham, because you work in big data, where do you stand on even the nearest edge conversation in the wake of some of the social media scandals about a right to privacy, a digital right to privacy? Where do you stand on that as someone who works in big data, but also wants to keep a human face on all of this and a human check?
Absolutely. It's probably one of the most important questions right now. I think the right to privacy is one that doesn't need to be traded just because you opt into some sort of service, right? There's many examples like insurance companies aren't allowed to, be prejudiced on race or political affiliation when they underwrite a policy, right? If I'm, expecting some sort of social media service, I should have a right to understand that my data isn't being used in a way that I don't agree with, right? But I think the right to privacy is extremely strong, is extremely important. The tricky aspect of it is the data can get duplicated, the data can get reverse engineered, bits and pieces of your data can reconstitute you. The ability for multiple parties to connect your data across a network of infinite decisions. I mean, we don't even understand how to repatriate all of our data and constitute the profiles that we have. So I actually think that the biggest problem in privacy is a capabilities one. Like, we may want to have privacy on the internet, but we don't even really know, how it is that we can just operate and have social media, which is an awesome way to scale communication, without the barriers in place yet.
So are you saying that it may be, as a practical matter, almost impossible to put that genie back in the bottle?
I think we do not know yet what that looks like, right? It could be some sort of blockchain thing where I'm giving out a token version of my privacy that can get audited, right? I do not think, as technologists, we have the answer, which means that we need to be doubly cautious about what we're doing now, not more laissez-faire. So a big component of being a little conservative with privacy rights when it comes to data right now.
Sarah, last chance for a silver lining. Some specific hope or wisdom?
I think, our notions of privacy full stop have changed over many, many years. Once upon a time we all lived together in houses, in and out, and, our notion of what actually privacy represents is an interesting topic in its own right. But what I see that is really interesting is people already learning how to subvert the system. So many people have multiple profiles and they talk about how they're managing their identities in different places, and I think that will become an industry in its own right pretty quickly. It will propagate an awful lot of information out in the system, which will then change what's in the system in a way that means it's not correct and accurate, and then you'll have to figure out how to solve that problem. It's going to be interesting.
Chameleon Inc. I like it. All right, well, don't fear the future, I think is the bottom line, but thank you for a great conversation about some of the things we need to watch out for, because this is coming, like it or not. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.